expectation. And so we talk today about neighbors, and we ask the question that the text that Michael read just a few moments ago asked of who is our neighbor. And we'll move in that direction here as we progress through the lesson. Neighbors. Wow, does that mean so many different things to us? You think over the years of the people that you would refer to as your neighbor. And there are experiences on all ends of the spectrum. In our hierarchy of relationships, we think about those that we're closest to. And there's sort of a list that we oftentimes give. We talk about family, friends, and neighbors. Neighbors don't rank as high as our dearest friends necessarily, but oftentimes our neighbors are very good friends. They're not quite family, but they're close. They're constant relationships. Unfortunately, maybe in a few instances, chronic relationships, but for the most part, really good relationships. It's interesting what neighbors expect, isn't it? You know, if you live where the person on the left or the right or the person across the street is very close to you, you realize that between the person to your left, the person to your right, and the person right across the street, you've probably got three different kinds of neighbors. And oftentimes that's the case. Some neighbors expect isolation. You know, some neighbors, as far as physical neighbors, really expect to be left alone. They expect you to be nice, they expect you to be kind, but they don't expect to have a whole lot to do with you. People sometimes tend to just want to mind their own business, and oftentimes they want you to mind your own business. Now, a few of us have had experiences with very difficult neighbors. Now, that's not the main thought that I want to present today, but I want to acknowledge that reality, because oftentimes that is the case. Sometimes we have neighbors that just don't want to be neighborly. They want to be left alone. They want you to leave them alone, and hopefully, if they want to be left alone, then maybe they leave you alone. But oftentimes, those relationships get challenging. But it's the other 90% of those relationships, or maybe 99% of those relationships, we want to think about this morning. There's a lot of funny things said about neighbors. A friend of mine one time, he said, I'm thinking about taking my tools and just carry them over to my neighbor's garage. And of course, he tells this little joke, expecting a response. And so I asked the obvious question, well, why would you take your tools and put them in your neighbor's garage? And he said, well, I like all my stuff being together. Obviously, the implication that his neighbor keeps borrowing things and not bringing them back. I like this one. I read, my neighbor's diary says that I have boundary issues. Now, I'm going to give you just a second one on that one. My neighbor's diary says I have boundary issues. Well, I suppose that would be the case. Carl Sandburg said it this way. He said, love your neighbor as yourself, but don't take down your fence. Which reminds us all of the old saying of good fences make good neighbors. And along that same line, Arthur Baer put it this way. He says, a good neighbor is one who smiles at you over the back fence but doesn't climb over it. And I suppose that's right. Reminded me of the TV show, and was it Tool Time? Was that the old show where, you know, the neighbor was always looking over the fence? And one of those kind of things, just an interesting little quirk about a TV show that keeps in our memory. It's also neighbors that prompted the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses. Because neighborhoods oftentimes sort of foster and spark a little bit of competition. Even Solomon in his wisdom talks about how that neighbors motivate neighbors, and oftentimes, or at least occasionally, not necessarily in a good way. It's Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 4. He says, then I saw that all the toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and striving after the wind. And I suppose that's true. a lot of what we do not because we necessarily wanted to or thought it was necessary, but because other people do, and we tend to want to keep up with other people, as the old saying goes. And so we do some things sparked by what our neighbor has. But for the most part, I don't know about you, and maybe we've just been fortunate of having some really good neighbors. Had an interesting experience with next door neighbor just in the last couple of days. Sandy, through a conversation with Miss Barbara, our next door neighbor, had found out that James had not been feeling really good. Well, they have this wonderful yard, and it's got flowers all over the yard. And so I thought, well, I'll mow his yard but then I thought, well, there's flowers all over the place and, all the spring growth. And I was a little concerned about maybe running over something I shouldn't have. So I thought, well, I'll ask. And so I asked, I said, James, I was out mowing my yard that day, so you were right there when I was in the midst of it. I said, how about if I just mow this side yard over here for you, all that spring growth? And he was thankful, but at the same time, he said, well, no, I think I need to do some more cleanup before it gets mowed, And I thought, well, okay, that's fine. And then next morning, flowers are on our front doorstep. Flowers out of the yard just at the, offer of help that was declined. And so it's nice to have wonderful and good neighbors. Think with me a minute about the basic teaching of the Bible about neighbors. It's passages that we know well. The first one that I think of is Matthew chapter 22, where the young man has been asked, what's the greatest commandment in the law? And the young man asked Jesus, I should say, as they're trying to entrap him, if you would. And Jesus' answer is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two depend all the law and the prophets. So Jesus tells us that even as you compare the Old Testament, and we think of the 10 commandments, but there were two overriding commandments, to love God and to love our neighbor. Romans chapter 13, again in similar fashion, verse 8 beginning, he says, owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandments are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That lets us know that what Jesus was saying, Paul just sort of reinforces it, that it's not that Jesus was ignoring the 10 commandments, but the 10 commandments are wrapped up in these two, to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so he says, any other commandment are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. And then one final passage that speaks in that same exact direction, it's the book of James, chapter 2 and verse 8. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You are doing well. In other words, to love your neighbor as yourself is a major part of the teachings of our Lord and of his disciples. And so it's a major point. And so if we do that, we're doing fairly well, is the implication. But then you have that question from the text of Luke chapter 10. Michael was reading just a little bit ago, where he asked the simple question, who is my neighbor? Now the reality is, Jesus has just gone over what is Luke's version of that Matthew 22 discussion, basically, where he asked the question, what's written in the law? What do you read? And the reading was that, the answer was, you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and you love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, do this, and you'll live. Well, then it's the man that turns around and asks the question in this context, where in verse 29 he says, he desiring to justify himself says to Jesus, who is my neighbor? People have asked that question over and over again. Who is my neighbor? And then so Jesus tells the story. The story of the priest and the Levite who sees a man who is in need, and they pass by on the other side of the road, not because necessarily they do not care, but because they apparently see that they've got, or believe they've got more important things to do. And you can even argue that both of them had important things to do. But most of us would argue, as Jesus tends to argue, and the point he's trying to make with these people here is that there are things that interrupt what was your plan. None of us have to be reminded of that right now at all, do we? Not at all. A lot of plans have been interrupted by this situation we find ourselves in the midst of. And you might say, well, a lot of plans, all of our plans have been interrupted. We have nothing planned to do as far as people getting together. All of those things are on hold. All of those things are on debate, at this particular point. So it's a good reminder to us. And as I suggested earlier, so many examples of people saying, well, here's what I would have normally been doing, but here's what needs to be done today. Here's what I would have normally done at this moment, but here's what needs to be done at this moment. Because that's the story of what we call the Good Samaritan here. The priest and the Levite had duties and obligations. They passed by. But the Samaritan, the demographic that the Jew of the day thought less of and would love, in most cases, to accuse of not being as good as themselves. And Jesus puts the Good Samaritan in the story, being the one that meets the needs. And he helped the man, and he took him to an inn, and he paid for his care, and he left his word that he would take care of whatever else was needed. And so at the end of that story, verse 36, Luke chapter 10, Jesus asked the obvious question, in a sense the rhetorical question, yet not so rhetorical because he asked it specifically. He says, which of these three, the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan, which of these three do you think, I like that, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? Well, the answer is obvious. It wasn't the answer they wanted to give. It wasn't what they wanted to admit. And if you'll notice the wording out of verse 37, the answer is, he said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. He wouldn't even say, well, it was the Samaritan. He wouldn't even use the term. He just said, well, the one who showed him mercy, obviously. I've talked to several people throughout this week, as many of you have. And the theme that kept coming up in the conversations that I was having is people were saying, well, my son or my daughter, they've brought things by that I needed, or, I'm out making a run occasionally, or my neighbors have called me and said if I need something, let them know. In every conversation like that I had throughout almost this entire week, the word neighbor got used. And so by the end of the week, I had to go in this direction because people are being neighborly. Seeing to the needs of those people around them, making sure that those people that are close to them have their needs met. And the bonus of a lot of the conversations I had this week, talking to several people who You knew we're probably doing well and probably out there helping other people, and you find so many of the people that you're concerned about are actually out there finding ways to help other people, and that's encouraging always. Finally, let me throw this at you. Neighbors remind us that we live in community. Neighbors remind us that there are neighbors that are basically family. And there are family that are neighbors by the definition that Jesus offers in Luke chapter 10. But it reminds us that community is bigger than we think. We've been reminded that we live in a global community without doubt in these last few weeks. But we're also reminded that each one of us, wherever we find ourselves, are in a community of neighbors being good neighbors. And there's nothing out in this world that speaks to what Christianity is supposed to be any more than that. That simple reality. A couple of passages as we sort of draw to a close. Ephesians chapter 4. At the end of Ephesians chapter 4, he's giving sort of some summarizing thoughts. He said an awful lot in Ephesians chapter 4. But at the beginning of that paragraph, which is the closing paragraph of Ephesians 4, verse 25 says, "Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another." Now, speaking the truth isn't obvious, and in the context, you understand why he says speaking the truth, and it will align perfectly with some other things that he'll say over the next few verses. But I like the reminder in the end of that verse, in the end of verse 25, where he says, "For we are members one of another." We are members one of another. And then I think of Romans chapter 15, verse 2. "Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up." It's easy when we give into worldly ways, because the world, by definition, is a pretty selfish place. And it's nice when we see the bright spots that prove to us that in their heart of hearts, most people are not that way. But notice the pronoun there. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. And you realize the use of the pronoun, and there's not much debate about it, because oftentimes, in a basically selfish world, we do what we do for our own good if we're not careful. But the child of God is called to do what you do for someone else's good as much as ever for your own. Because he says, let no one seek his own good. But you seek to please your neighbor, to build him up. 1 Corinthians 10:24, in a very similar way. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. We're definitely in a time of great challenge, and that great challenge shows good people. And good people shine in great challenge. So many examples of that. Let me encourage us all in the midst of a challenge to shine as good neighbors. It's what God has called us to. It's the kind of people that our God is, and it's the kind of people that he wants us to be. As we look around, As we see our neighbors, let's see what we can do this week to serve those around us. I know you're doing it already, and let me commend you for that. Like I say, everybody you talk to, you find out more and more that that's what people are doing in the midst of a challenging time. As we close this lesson, let me encourage you. Reach out if you need help, whatever help that might be. Reach out. You may need to reach out to your elders just to share struggles, ask for prayers, and ask for assistance in various ways. Feel free to do that. They would welcome your call, an email, a connection, a text of any kind. And we'll see what we can do to meet any need that we find. God bless you. We love you. We're here for you for whatever you need. And thank you for being there for your neighbors. Let's sing together.